Thanks so much, Iman. Mic check 1 2 1 2. If you'd like a wrap at the end, then please note that the payment will have to be doubled, but we can arrange that. It's a great privilege. Thank you so much to Sapoa. Thank you so much to Neil and the board and all the members of the management team. And what an incredible time and an auspicious time to be dissecting the complex political landscape that we are confronted with in the aftermath of one of our country's most contested elections and facing not one but two State of the Nation addresses within the space of 4.5 months. I think we can all agree that this is the appropriate time. And I've been feeling, I don't know if you've been feeling similar, that this is the appropriate time to take stock of what the Ramaphosa era has meant and what it means and what it might mean, and an important time to preview what this next era in our political landscape presages. So I'd like to do that for a fairly short period today. I'll detain you for about 15 minutes because we've got a significant panel, and if nothing else, I'm interested to hear what the panel has to say so that I can make good remarks on the SONA tonight. But I'd like to just do three things as I attempt to disentangle our political milieu. First, I'd like to speak about the macro-political situation. That is, at the level of the state, at the level of parliament, at the level of cabinet, at the level of provincial legislatures. What has changed and what remains the same? And then secondly, I'd like to zoom into some of the micro-political dynamics and have a look at the political parties, particularly the ANC, the DA, and the EFF, that predominate in our political conversation, and talk through some of the dynamics that I think we are likely to see unfold in the immediate period ahead. And then finally link that to the broader socio-economic situation and the dramatic crises, some of which I'm sure have been debated in depth, that confront us and how this political contestation feeds into our country's problems. And though there's much talk of a new dawn, I'd prefer to echo Cape Townian poet Rustam Kuzain, who speaks about a new house, but the sense of an old scent. And that's really the theme of my conversation here. I talk about a new house, but the sense of an old scent, because when we look at the South African political landscape right now, I think it's fair to say that there's been, in many ways, unnoticed and quite dramatic political change. When you consider that just a few weeks ago we came out of a very important election that I think had quite paradoxical outcomes. On the one hand, the ANC continues to wield power, but on the other hand has lost a significant degree of control. And so I think the ANC had an excellent election to the extent that it continues to predominate in provinces and in parliament. But we now have the most contested political landscape that our democracy has ever seen at the macro political level. And at the first sitting of parliament, I sat in the press gallery and overlooked the parliamentary chamber. And for the first time in our history, bar 1 or 2 seats on the opposition side, we essentially have 2 poles, an opposition bench, as it were, and a government bench. And across the country in different legislatures, in different seats of power, I don't think we've sufficiently grasped that we now have the most contested democracy that we have ever had. That despite the fact that the ANC continues to exert influence and power in all legislatures and in parliament, it has never had less control over the legislative environment and the ramifications that has for the executive environment in our country. And I think what that means is that we are set not for a period of unbridled renewal, nor are we set for a period of unmitigated catastrophe. And I think we all have sufficient experience of that, having lived through the last 10 years. But what I really think is we're entering a new era of ambiguity. And so for anyone who is hoping for certainty to come out of this moment, I hate to disappoint you, but in my view, we are truly entering an era of the opposite, an era of increasing uncertainty, increasing ambiguity, and increasing ambivalence. And this, I think, will be played out not only in the parliamentary chamber or provincial legislatures, but also within the political parties that contest the political terrain itself. And so having charted what I think will be the overriding theme of the next political period, let me delve into some more of the details. And by the way, because I'm of a different generation, please feel free to take out your phones as long as you're tweeting about this talk. And please feel free to tweet and make this a digital as well as an in-room conversation. But please tweet nice things about the talk as well. So what does this mean for President Ramaphosa, and what does President Ramaphosa mean for us? I think neither a new dawn nor the kind of catastrophe that we experienced under President Zuma. I think ultimately President Ramaphosa will be an ambiguous president. He will take 2 steps to the right, and then he will take 2 steps to the left. We will move forward and experience moments of profound hope, and then we will move backwards and experience moments of profound discomfort. And I think above all, it's time for us to rid ourselves of this juvenile narrative that we're going to be saved, and appreciate that we are going to be left in a position of profound ambiguity. And it's going to be extremely confusing, because one moment the new Dawnists will claim victory and shout from the rooftops, "I told you so." And the next moment, when the president does something different, those who wish to denigrate him will say, "Yeah, but you see, President Ramaphosa has always been this way." And the truth is, I think President Ramaphosa is a bit of both. He is facing incredibly difficult dynamics within the ANC, some of which he partook of, and he has a mission to try and change South Africa. And those two conflicting and dual motives, I think, will color his term in office. And so ambiguity and ambivalence, I think, will be the order of the day. And that's the same within political parties. Because if you look at the ANC itself, it's fairly clear, to me at least, that there is a great deal of ambiguity, not only surrounding policy, but surrounding who holds the upper hand within the party at any given time. And when I say upper hand, I don't just mean a majority, but the ability to frustrate, which requires less than a majority in many cases. And so I think we've seen with appointments an attempt, on the one hand, as I say, to take a step forward, but on the other hand, that step being constrained by the very real dynamics within the party, which will keep that ambiguity and uncertainty going, in my view, in the Ramaphosa era. But the same is also true on the opposition benches. So let's take the Democratic Alliance, for example. I think the DA is also going to go through a period of profound contestation and ambiguity. And so actually what we'll see over the ensuing, I think, years, and probably in the first Ramaphosa term, in my view, is concurrent political battles in the 3 major parties. So let me get on to the DA's battle. We know the ANC's battle fairly well. I think the DA will be fighting a concurrent battle as the ANC fights its battle for the soul of the DA, which will increase ambiguity within that party and contestation within that party. Ultimately, I think the question over whether the nettle of transformation should be rhetorically grasped will continue to pervade DA debates and split the party. And ultimately, I think over this period, as the ANC tries to determine who it will be in this new period, the DA will also have a serious battle on its hand, which will be seen, I think, by whether the DA CEO stays in office or not. We've seen James Self, who has stepped aside after a very long period in the chairpersonship of the party, and whether what I think is quite, in many ways, it's counterintuitive, but a radical strand of thought within the DA will decide that it wants to go alone, even if it has a smaller electoral piece of the puzzle and forward a specific agenda, or whether it wishes to pursue that agenda within the umbrella of the DA. So we have that concurrent battle going on But we also have a third concurrent battle within the EFF. Now, the EFF is in a rather difficult position because, on the one hand, it has performed relatively well, juxtaposing its performance in the last election. But it suddenly now has a caucus double the size in parliament that it will have to keep in check, and double the caucus, double the politics, double the complexity, and double the fun, I suspect. And so, as the EFF approaches its National People's Assembly at the end of this year, I suspect we will see for the first time contestation within the party, and probably contestation for senior leadership positions within the party. And I think that will raise the question of ambiguity for the EFF and spark a third concurrent political battle, which will run in parallel with the three battles in our major political parties in South Africa. And so, far from a period of certainty and a period in which a clean break is made with the past, I suspect that we are going into a period of uncertainty, a period of ambiguity, and a period of heightened contestation. And maybe that's not the worst thing in the world, because at some point, it's important that our democracy becomes a democracy and contestation happens in the chambers of parliament as opposed to in locked doors in the National Executive Committee of parties that the public can't exert direct control over. Now, there are various issues within our country that will fall into this milieu, and this is where I'll end, and I hope this will be a moment at which we can spark further debate. Because all this contestation and ambiguity would be wonderful if we were in the political and economic position where our economy was booming and we were talking about the margins. But this ambiguity comes at a time where we have virtually zero wiggle room, and questions of extremely contentious policy are before us. Questions like the land question, which I'd love to delve into as we explore this further. But I'd like to turn the script and focus on just one small question, which I think this audience is particularly interested and poised to address. And that is, just to end off, the question of the South African government's property portfolio. Now, Scandinavian economists Dag Dieter and Stefan Vosloo wrote a profoundly earth-shattering, in my view, book about the public wealth of nations. And so while we have this extreme contestation and we have a lot of difficulty on the political horizon, I wonder whether the South African government's property portfolio might actually be a way out of this crisis, or at least a way to the solution. The reason I say that is, and I'd love to know from this room, maybe in the audience, does anybody know what the consolidated property portfolio of the entire South African state amounts to? I know the government doesn't know it, because I have had debates with the Treasury on this, and it's okay because most governments don't know what their consolidated property portfolio is. Not just state buildings, but local buildings, municipal properties, from police stations to schools. The entire property portfolio, these Scandinavian economists say, is an untapped resource in any state. And if you can sweat an asset like a consolidated property portfolio and generate just 1% return, they estimate that you could generate as much as 4% of GDP by consolidating the state property portfolio. So I just wonder, in all the contestation and the ambiguity that's before us, whether the expertise that are in this room might be able to divine a policy that none of the parties are talking about, but to think through how, if we used the South African government's property portfolio for beneficial purposes, we consolidated it and we sweated the assets, we might be able to generate revenue that would at least not navigate us out of contestation, but give us greater revenue wiggle room for a period of increased uncertainty. So I wanted to put that provocation before you, and a number of provocations before you today, and just to say that this is the context in which we fall, an existential crisis of a miracle overstretched, to quote our great poet Lebo Mashile. And it's in this context which I hope we can engage in debate on not one, but two SONAs that confront us today. Thank you very much.
Welcome to all of my guests. I'm going to be on the edge in keeping with, I suppose, some of the sentiments of many South Africans today. What I'd love is for the panel really to just feel free to workshop some of the ideas that Sizwe had. Are we in this phase of ambivalence and uncertainty to the extent in which he's described it? And Karima, maybe we can ask you to open.
Okay, I'd like to just immediately take issue with the presentation itself, because it framed the conversation in a very passive way. This is what we want from the president. Can he do it? It didn't ask us what it is that we can do as a society. So I'm really interested in South Africans no longer outsourcing their responsibilities to big men and women in politics. I'm interested in a society that is engaged. So for example, this forum needs to be engaged with Patricia de Lille now, who heads up this massive property portfolio. I think it's the biggest property portfolio in the country, Sizwe, around, for example, the issue of the continued apartheid spatial planning that locks the majority of people out of South Africa's economy. I come from this province. I grew up in Claremont. We were removed by the Group Areas Act. I ended up living in Mitchell's Plain. It took me 3 hours to get to school every day. And I traveled the train for 12 years. Now, we've been seeing trains burning in Cape Town, for example. What I want to know is, what are you going to do as property developers when government is going to be putting up social housing next to your posh properties, whose value you think will be dropping because poor people will be living next to you? So I don't think the questions that we must pose here today are questions for Cyril Ramaphosa. I think we must pose questions to the constituencies that we represent. And this is a very rich constituency. This is a constituency that sits on private property. And it is being challenged to put themselves in the shoes of someone like my mother, who was a factory worker in the sort of a district that is now being gentrified, and where people can no longer access the places of their home and have to go and live even further from their places of work. So yes, there is ambiguity around the period that we're in, and there is uncertainty. But I think we are part of the process of creating certainty, depending on the choices that we make. Right. Cyril Ramaphosa's main strategy is what he calls social compacting, which is putting different social partners in a room to try and negotiate a deal. And in that deal, there must be trade-offs. So I'd like to challenge this audience about what trade-offs they're prepared to make to undo apartheid spatial planning that will allow poor South Africans to actually be involved in the economy in such a way that they don't have to work in order to get to work.
All right, so I think the challenge has been set, and we can certainly pick that up with anyone in the room who wants to respond to that. I did mention on day one of the conference that we had the initial dinner at the CEO's dinner with the new Public Works and Infrastructure Minister, Minister Patricia de Lille, in which she expressed that intention to really work with the property sector and to make sure that those kinds of, mutually beneficial partnerships do come up, and that you also show a level of agency in terms of some of the issues the challenges that you've been raising. It does happen in a context, though, and that's part of the challenge of this room, is to understand keenly through your eyes what the challenge is politically, and I think that's what you were setting out to do. Ibrahim, the president, is fighting a war on two fronts. The one is trying to make everything look okay for our investors out there so that money can keep coming into our country. And incidentally, I think we've received the highest level of FDI on Ghana, if I'm correct, according to the UN recently. The other challenge is what's happening back home. People biting at his heels, he's got to fend them off. How does he manage that in a way that reduces the uncertainty and gives us more clarity?
He doesn't, and he can't, because Sizwe is being incredibly kind by euphemistically calling it ambiguity. In fact, it's much stronger, It's not ambiguity, it's fundamental contradiction. Because what you have inside the governing party is a set of people who believe fundamentally contradictory things, polar opposite to what the others in another faction believe. I'm also being euphemistic in kind. I'm assuming that the factions are based on ideas, when in fact they're not. In fact, it would have been healthy had we had, so factionalism is not a problem. Had we had factions based on ideas, we might in fact have more productive oversight and better institutional functioning. That's not what we have. What we have is factions based on primary mercurial interests. And of course, I hate to say, but some of us are complicit in this because we side with one or other faction depending on how or they do or don't serve our interests.
When you say we, who do you mean, Ibrahim?
Executives, CEOs, I don't count myself as one of those. Please note, I'm on the left of the room, ideologically speaking. So, there is very little the president can do. It's much stronger than ambiguity, it's fundamental contradiction. So what's the way out? Society has to play a part. This is where I agree with Karima. But how do you get active citizens when citizens are, 17 million of us, and by us I mean South Africans, are dependent on welfare transfers, social grants, and living off the informal economy. So the first is one, to formalize the informality or the large scale of informality in the economy. That's one. The second is I think CEOs and senior managers have to start taking a hard, long look at the kind of salaries, bonuses, LTIs, long-term incentives, and short-term incentives. It is impossible to continue to exist in a country with such deep levels of poverty, extreme inequality, and still have this perpetuated. Now, please make no mistake, I may be on the left, but I'm not arguing for a mad socialist republic in which the dictatorship of the proletariat is going to set what a CEO salary level should be. I'm simply asking that CEOs and senior managers start to think a little bit about this and ring fence about 3 or 4% of their LTIs and short-term incentives to cross-subsidize entry-level jobs.
Yeah.
Even though those jobs may not be productive in the short term, someone's going to have to take the pain. Unfortunately, it is not the president, it is not the ANC.
And again, I'd love to hear how this audience pushes back against that, because over the last day or so, we've heard that in a context of low GDP, you have vacancies in your buildings, there are lower rentals, that you are feeling the pinch, and so that's why you also can't expand, because you can't afford to hire more people. So those two things are standing almost at opposites with each other. Max du Preez, you know, are we overstating or understating how big an influence contestation at political level is in terms of how it plays out in the rest of society? I mean, just over the last however many hours, we've had the new nominations from the ANC around its portfolio chair, well, the names for those who are recommended to the portfolio chair, committees as chairs. And they are people who are not, you know, whose hands aren't exactly pristine.
Phew, that is a euphemism if I've ever heard one. Not exactly clean. Here, if I read the sort of room, I would say profound pessimism compared to this time last year, or February, March last year, profound optimism. And yet, a lot of things have gone right in the last year. And so why are we, across the board, so pessimistic, so downtrodden about what is going to happen next? Mainly, I would say, because all of us, including the Ramaphosa grouping, hugely underestimated the damage of the 9 years of Zuma, especially the last 5. What that had done to the economy, possibly around 1.6, 1.7 trillion rand of damage, but mostly because of what it had done to our social fabric, to our political culture. A populism, a cheap populism that makes a political conversation, an exchange of ideas, very difficult right now. Because with the help of Bell Pottinger, he came with stuff, Zuma came with stuff that he didn't believe in. Radical economic transformation, white monopoly capital, all sort of red herrings to take our attention away from the looting and state capture. But it remained. So the Ramaphosa faction, and mea culpa, I'm one of them, we massively underestimated the capacity of these state capture groupings to fight back. And we massively overestimated the power of the new president and his grouping to assert themselves. And there was this crude theory, you all know it, that it's okay to have all these other guys because the law, the criminal justice system will deal with them in time. Well, we keep on saying that. Well, the criminal justice system didn't do its job because at least 6 of the chairpersons of the portfolio committees belong in jail, not in parliament. And this is, one doesn't say this lightly, but go and look at the record of at least 6, possibly 8 of those people. I mean, Faith Mutambi, Mosebenzi Zwane should not be in any public body. They should be for a court of law.
Right.
So we underestimated, we overestimated, and now we sit, and in your profession, I get a lot of people who are just like totally depressed, and the first thing they say is this land thing. So there's this binary thing going on with land. The Constitution will be changed, if not this year, then early next year. Not only because of a 2/3 majority EFF-ANC, not only because the ANC made the decision, but also because the Presidential Advisory Panel advised that. Now, please, for God's sake, let's make peace with that and say it is more dangerous not to change the Constitution because the political dynamics had changed. So it has to. How will it change? We have a good idea how it will change. A slight difference in language in the Constitution, then referring to an expropriation bill or act. We know what that is. It is before Parliament. And I think if we embrace, especially people in your profession, if we embrace this process and say, it has to happen, it is the original sin, this is one step towards solving it, then maybe we will strengthen, in real terms, property rights, because that's what concerns you.
Okay.
And
Take
we
a breath
can,
there for
and
me,
this
Max.
one last thought, and then we can actually, Sizwe was talking about the government's property portfolio in the cities. I'm interested in another sense. Can we get our hands on some of that state property in the cities and give it to the people, please?
And that forms part, I think, of a round of, if you want to, you're more than welcome. Go ahead. Let me not stop you. You want to clap? Do it. And I think we must come back on that, and I suspect that you might want to embroider on that point a little bit more. But here's the thing. So you have a president who everyone, and Peter Hain was also saying yesterday, warning against the extremities of assessment. He's either great or, he's either doomed for failure, and we kind of have to live somewhere in between. But the very real things that we're talking about who he gets to appoint, who the ANC gets to suggest, are people that are deeply compromised, which suggests that his hand is weakened. Your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Iman. Indeed, we have the president who, at times, we wake up saying we don't want him. The next day, we wake up being so happy like he's Mbongis. That's how we are as South Africans also. We tend to look at things in terms of the extreme. In South Africa, you are either a very bad leader or an excellent leader. You are never a leader we could live with. And that is how we are assessing this presidency. We want to see a radical shift from problems that have become institutionalized. And this is how I want to link this with the theme that Sizwe actually raised here, just to stay within that theme that we are moving into that year of uncertainty. We are a country that does not know how to operate under uncertainty. We have a very strong history of strong leaders. Even under apartheid, there is a culture in South Africa of a strong leader. That is what is expected by the people. It's not these leaders themselves. We craft them as we see them, and of course, we have a history as well. So to go just slightly further on the theme that you introduced, I'll even challenge you and say that it's not a year of uncertainty. It's decades of uncertainty that are coming. Because my view here is that South Africa's politics is evolving towards becoming a modern complex politics. Modern complex politics don't have policy certainty. There is no policy certainty in the White House as we speak. There isn't policy certainty in some of the major democracies. Brexit, for example, there isn't a policy certainty.
So this shouldn't spook us, is what you're saying.
We shouldn't be so much worried. We should start to learn to map the patterns of uncertainty and survive within that patterns of uncertainty, because for me, it's not always bad to have this level of uncertainty, because what that means is that the center of politics that used to define us, the ANC that you speak about as having been weakened, the ANC has lost that legitimacy as the center. There are multiple centers in South Africa. There is a strong lobbying of politics in South Africa. The EFF, which is a party that was sitting at 6.2%, could successfully lobby a party that was sitting at 62% for a policy concession that was measured on land. So we need to understand that there is that emergence of multiple centers of power in South Africa. There is an understanding that you can actually lobby and succeed, lobby the policy, I will say the policy center. And I also think, one last point, we need to stop thinking of the archaic idea of factions within the ANC. It doesn't lead us anywhere. The factions are the Zuma faction, Mr. Ramaphosa's faction. That's the end of analysis. That's a boring conversation. I would like to think about the interest groups within the ANC. People that are complex and they understand the functioning of power, they move across the factions. It's not just clearly cut in terms of the factions. They are just the people within the ANC who might not have a view on Mr. Ramaphosa or Mr. Magashule. All they want is a seat around the table. I wouldn't see them as a faction. I'll see them as a lobby interest group. There's multiple within the ANC. There are also multiple outside the ANC as well.
Well, here's the thing for you, Ongama, as a political economist. You know, Ralph is saying this is par for the course. This happens in countries around the world, even the most developed economies. But the writing is on the wall in terms of our economic numbers and the data, which is looking increasingly bad, and the projections continue to look bad. What can we do from your perspective to kind of shore up sentiment in South Africa, given that so much has already been defined and is in play already?
I like the flow of conversation, and thanks to Sizwe for outlining it, and then the colleagues for putting in the detail. Here's one word that I would like to leave, if anybody's going to forget what I'm going to say in the next few minutes. Systemic resilience and democratic resilience. And to explain it, one has to think about us and us, as well as the territory we're in, as a living system. I'm a whole in relation to everything that's in me, but only a part in relation to the bigger whole. And systems thinking is this idea that the various spaces, be they social, political, economic, are only a part in relation to bigger spaces. So, for example, where we are going to see answers, or in fact, where we must derive comfort amidst a chaotic, crisis-ridden political economic system, is in the resilience of our institutions, whether they are local or global. Because while you may find, for example, that the balance of power in parliament is skewed towards forces which may not act in the best interest of South Africans, the broader political economic space, as well as the regulatory framework, allows us to reinforce and get recourse where things go bad at any one level. So one issue we've not spoken about much is how the crisis that is taking place politically and elsewhere, even in higher education, points to a deeper crisis of nationhood in the country. The idea that South Africa just doesn't work. It hasn't worked for the majority of the people since 1994, in fact, since forever. And now the middle and upper classes are actually getting to feel the brunt of what the average person has been feeling in South Africa all along. And what that is doing is forcing us to kind of search for what is our place and contribution, as history dictates that we must now come along and play a role. So, for example, an economy with a crisis where there's a high vacancy rates in mainstream properties, it's everywhere. I mean, I see it in PE where I come from. One of two things happens. either it is allowed to collapse, or those that have been at the helm of the economy start thinking, what can we do differently so that we can leverage the assets that we have? We have the assets, that they are not working in the ways they have worked for some time should not lead to a total collapse. So what then happens? Those spaces get opened to businesses. So the pathway to formality for a woman that sells by the street side may be a landlord that says, rather than allowing this building to stand vacant for a long time, let me put a few of these women in and see what happens. And I kid you not, when we start focusing inwardly in terms of solutions, we can find that our answers lie there. Lastly, on this topic, we did a study for Kucha, the special economic zone. And what we found was that even greater than FDI, when you have locally grown businesses expanding, they tend to have a greater multiplier effect in the economy. Why? Precisely because they grow with their local suppliers. They grow the entire value chain. So the crisis that we find ourselves in, in a nutshell, the message, the response to your question, the crisis that we find ourselves in, we must at least take comfort that the resilience of our political economic system is guaranteed in the institutions. And every crisis helps to entrench those institutions.
All right.
But it requires to think creatively about how we come out, and we all have a role to play.
All right, Karim, I'm going to let you come in, and I think we can just open it up. I mean, I've asked you some opening questions. You might have some kind of keen observations that are based on what your panelists have said that you want to throw in. You're more than welcome to do it. Go ahead.
I want to talk about the economy. I think that the conversation or the point that Ralph Matega made about the economic debates being seen in factional context is a boring conversation. He's right. But the discussion around our policy choices should be taken out of that loaded political environment. We have tried a certain way of doing economics for the last 25 years. The definition of madness, I think, according to Einstein, is to do the same thing all the time and expecting a different result. So for 25 years, we've been doing various forms of capitalism. Some call it developmental, others crony, others capitalism with a human face, state capitalism through state-owned enterprises. It hasn't yielded us anything. In fact, real wages have actually dropped. Real inequality has grown. We are the most unequal society in terms of pay incomes in the world. Now, the people leading the conversation about an alternative economic system, unfortunately, do not have the political bona fides to be trusted with that conversation, because they are, in fact, the looters. They are, in fact, the ones that have decapacitated an already fragile state that was built off the bankruptcy of what apartheid had left us. And I think we need to begin to ask ourselves, are our business models correct? Are the way in which we understand growth and wealth correct? How do we measure GDP, for example? Where do we, for example, place women's work that are done in the home that has no financial value attached to it? That which is not counted cannot be measured. And so if you lock out, for example, what women at home do out of the economy, you can't measure how you get to GDP. So what defines GDP is conversations that we must have, but they cannot be led by Julius Malema and Ace Magashule, because both of them have shown by example that they are not interested in changing fundamentally the economic injustices of this country. What they are interested in is using the state as the bridge to access largesse in it. And they've done so quite successfully. And that is what is worrying about this conversation, because everybody else in society is sitting back. Because all they're saying is that we just had the wrong people. We have the right system, but we have the wrong people. I'm sorry to disappoint you people. If Ibrahim says he's left, I'm further left. We have the wrong system, and we have dishonest people. We need to relook our system. We need to
okay.
relook our economic system, our business model systems. If you're a small business owner, you cannot have 2 homes, a boat, and go to Europe. It doesn't work like that because labor isn't chattel. And when you're going to give your person an increase, it shouldn't threaten the very existence of your business. And that is how apartheid capitalism grew, on exploitative super exploitation with super profits. And we're still in that mode. And that's why you're hoarding your cash in your banks and you don't want to actually put it into the South African economy. What makes me really perplexed is the fact that foreign business people can understand that citizens need to own their own land. And that actually gives you more security in the long run. But local business feels threatened by that idea. It's
Right.
bizarre.
I think the practical question then becomes, I mean, so what's the trigger point for this? The ANC is, as you say, following the rule of insanity, or in terms of its policy preferences or
Not just the
choices.
ANC, Iman, business as well. Because business encourages the various ways of capitalism in South Africa. And it hasn't worked. And mind you, it's not working globally either.
All right, so things are as they are. What's the starting point then, if you agree that that's kind of, structural change has to take place? Well, what's the starting point, Ibrahim?
It's simple and it's seductive at the same time. It's purely institutions. And if I take both the analogy by Ongama and Ralph, I take issue with that. There's no sense in saying the uncertainty is global and the uncertainty is something we've got to live with. Of course we have to live with that. The problem is that everywhere else where there is uncertainty, there are sufficiently robust institutions. We don't have those institutions to navigate you out of any kind of major crises that you come across. So Europe has major crises, granted, but they've got the resilient institutions to see them through it. They also have a much less predatory capitalism and a much less predatory business elite. Because our problem on Ongama is that we can't talk about a resilient political economy when we have a political economy which has been built fundamentally on the back of 2 sectors, agriculture and mining. And both of those have been fundamentally exploitative in the extreme. Now that you've got greater diversification, if there's been anything good that Mbeki has brought to this country, it is both the idea that we can run our own systems and institutions, but also that we can diversify our economy. Now, we have diversified our economy, but nowhere near sufficiently enough, firstly. And secondly, what you have is that though you've got diversification, you've got a parallel set of monopolies which develop with it. And those monopolies develop simply because of the predatory nature of what our business class looks like. Now, I'm not as left as Karima, but there is something that has to be done about the way in which we conduct business. Because forget the question of politics. The politicians and people in public authority are not going to save us. There are far too many contradictions, there are far too many uncertainties, there are far too many problems.
Okay,
They are
so-
internally focused and they haven't learned the lesson. You have massive decreases in the amount of public trust and confidence in institutions. That was shown in the last election by the drop in voter turnout. If these guys continue to be so internally focused, no one's going to come back to the party. So the question here is that we've got to make our own party and we've got to stop relying on these fellows to do, because they're rotten, they're
A whole other
capricious.
party again.
Yeah.
I don't know. So Max, Ibrahim wants us to switch off our TVs tonight and not watch the Sona because it's going to be nonsense and they don't know what they're doing. And it's not a sentiment I haven't heard before, by the way. But if you had to hack the economy or hack the politics, as the young people say, where is our mainstay? What should we be pivoting on? In South African politics as sources of hope and optimism for us. Because whether we like it or not, things are bad, but we need something to hold it. We need a lifeboat.
Yeah.
Maybe not a CX lifeboat, but we certainly need a lifeboat.
My argument is that we need to actively fight dogma and orthodoxy. When we talk about our success as a country, we measure it in terms of GDP. Our GDP shrunk by 3.2% in the first quarter. The ordinary citizen doesn't give a damn it doesn't know what that means. And we measure all these things, and all these economists sit some of them around me, and give us very learned assessments. Should we not be able to get rid of all this dogma and orthodoxies and say, isn't the state's fundamental task to look after the well-being of the people? So instead of measuring our GDP, let's measure the happiness of our people. And this is not airy-fairy. It says we can't make our economy grow. We can't control our currency. We sit with ESCOM, but what can we do? We can fix local government so that unhappy, unemployed citizen at least have a decent environment. He or she has a stand, a little house that he or she owns. There are basic services. The trains work properly. We live in Cape Town. I mean, there is no train commuting that is safe or on time. You fix the clinics, you fix education. It doesn't cost extra money. I would like us to shift away from these learned academic arguments and go back to the people and say, what will make your life better? We can't give you a job right now, but what can we not go to a 4-day work week, for instance? Instead of firing 400,000 people from ESCOM and the civil service, why don't we say, guys, we can't afford another 500,000 families out of work. Why don't we do a 4-day work week and you take a 10% dip? We don't talk about those kind of things. We're talking about the free market, capitalist orthodoxy on this side, and then you get the EFF and all those guys shouting extreme orthodoxy from the other side.
Sizwe.
One thing you must never do is make a political analyst give a speech and then put a panel of political analysts to critique their speech. This is a torturous position in which to be. But I think the large theme of the discussion has centered, and I think largely concurred with the notion that there's going to be increased uncertainty, contradiction, and ambiguity in our politics going forward. And I'd just like to say that that's a complete sea change from the political discussion that we were having a year or a year and a half ago. And I think we need to admit that, because the discussion that was being had a year or a year and a half ago was, we are going to be saved. And President Ramaphosa is going to grasp the nettle and a new dawn is upon us. And you only need to refer to the political discourse during that period to realize that saying there's going to be uncertainty and ambiguity is not concurring with the orthodoxy. It's actually showing that there has been a profound change in the South African political landscape, and I think we need to own that. And then this question, I think, that has pervaded the discussion largely is, okay, so if there's going to be uncertainty, what do we do about it? Well, I think the two questions are linked, quite frankly, and it's not enough to say we must do something, because the politics does matter. And the politics and society link, because I think the time has come for us to stop giving President Ramaphosa a blank check and saying, oh, no, it's difficult. Oh, no, he's trying. Oh, no, there's a game of chess. Our politics only works when society holds our politicians accountable for what they do. And the longer we stand back and say, President Ramaphosa should be given this window of opportunity, the longer we fail to play our social role, which is our key democratic role, in actually holding politicians to account and making them feel that they're under pressure so that they have less wiggle room to compromise. And I think we've failed in that responsibility, and I think the State of the Nation address is an important moment in which I think our country needs to turn around and say, Mr. President, as the person who leads the society, we're no longer prepared to accept an inability to grasp the nettle.
I'm going to give the final words to Ngama and to Ralph, only because we're really pressed for time. We're being asked in South Africa for everyone to play their roles. And I think, Karima, you set that scene, for example, like people in this room, to reach out and be more proactive and to have some agency. We're being asked not to think in terms of orthodoxy, not to see, things in terms of extremities and polarities either. So from your perspective then, given that we have to kind of keep an open mind, I think, and suspend a lot of our political, economic dogma that we've had over time, we cannot do it alone as citizens. There need to be some strong signals as well from our body politic. Are they strong enough?
Yeah, so the problem with grand narratives is that if we say it's a period of whether it's contradictions or ambiguity, we then get trapped into a feeling that everything else must confirm that. That's not how life is. Life is full of contradictions. It's okay for people to hope that Ramaphosa he has got something to offer. He has got something to offer. The ANC, if you look at its manifesto, it shows an organization that has been growing over time to the extent that it affirms both the need for a private sector that plays a role and a state that plays a role. So there, there's a settlement. It was settled on something. We're in agreement as South Africans about, we have a national consensus. Beneath it, we do have crises of who has got a stake, who does not, and how do we open up. But I want to take your idea, Iman, about openness. In times of crisis, when we have things that have not worked, one of the biggest things we can do is to be humble and say, in this country, with multitudes of people who are unemployed, there are people somewhere who are living and they are doing something right. So there's a method, in fact, that's used in development. It's called asset-based community development. Communities have built assets over time. They are leveraging those assets one way or another. We can come as people who have whatever, whether you're a professional, whatever the case may be, and be humble to learn what's working in our communities. It's in shacks, it's in townships, everywhere there's something that's working. We need to leverage it. We need to come together and leverage what works in this country, but we can't do it with no humility and openness. So we need to be open and acknowledge that there are some things that work, and we need to work together to make them, to massify them.
And with our final round of oratory, the fiery Ralph Mateja is going to bring this panel to a close.
Well, you know, Iman, when I heard that...
At least live up to the hype, Ralph.
when I heard that the president is cutting the budget of Mbongi, I also thought it meant he's not interested in praising us himself about his leadership, that we have to critically evaluate him. But I don't think we have done that as South Africans. We still want to frame our solution in one person, as much as, and we did the same when it comes to framing the problem. There are no shortcuts. The best way out of this is to just educate citizens about what they are entitled to, what are their obligations. We are stakeholders, we are part of the elites, we are on the leftist, we are on the rightist, and so forth. But what is most importantly is the logic of how voters actually vote. And I think the most important thing is just to empower communities in that way, through civil society and so forth. Without that, relying on unity within the ANC to solve problems, for me, it's never going to happen. There is no body politics in South Africa that is going to produce unity as we know it. We just have to learn to function the manner in which things are.
I'm taking a deep breath. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking and congratulating our panel. I think they did an excellent job.